This is Building Rural-Urban Solidarity from the Red Talk presented at the General Meeting of the Portland DSA, March 8, 2020. What is rural? Most of us would agree that there are many kinds of cities. Portland isn't Miami, Chicago isn't LA, none of them are New York. By the same token, there are many kinds of rural. Oregon, for instance, has several of them in one state. We've got farmland, forests, mountains, high desert, and the coast. For a lot of people, rural places are mainly recreation or afterthoughts. They're landscapes we go to visit for a few days, or they're what we see outside of the car window in between two cities. For capitalism, rural areas are places to extract wealth from natural resources. The people who live and work in rural places are a means to that end. So who is rural? Something you may have noticed about the pictures in the previous slide is that there weren't any people in them. Rural places can seem pretty empty compared to the city, but trust me, there are people, and it's not just the stereotypes. If you get into statistics, you'll hear that rural America is old, white, and poor. But we can't operate on that assumption alone. There are plenty of graphs that can break down the demographics of rural America to show that it's not only white, or only cisgender, or only heterosexual or Christian. The graph to the right here shows the racial differences between urban and rural America. Both are predominantly white, and you'll see that the rural American graph is generally more white, but that isn't true for every town. There are still millions of people who don't fit the stereotype, and there are plenty of people in Portland who came from small towns here in Oregon and elsewhere. Many of us have rural ties, some positive, some negative. The point is, the people living in those places, family of ours and friends we haven't met yet, are fighting some of the same fights that we are fighting. What is rural organizing? Besides some mix of rural people organizing in rural spaces around rural issues, I'd like to focus on the idea of organizing toward rural-urban solidarity, instead of focusing on a rural-urban divide. People spend a lot of time trying to define the rural-urban divide. What we don't see very often is a call for solidarity. As with any solidarity, we aren't looking to diminish any real differences of experience or resources. Instead, we should be looking at our shared material needs and the obstacles standing in our way to achieving them. We can find out more about each other, our respective histories and strengths and perspectives, and build something stronger together. But with that comes a caveat. I'm not asking for every socialist to prioritize this, but if you're interested or worried, this is a way to start digging in and connecting with other people who are in the same fight as us. We're all familiar with the limitations of black and white thinking, and I want you to apply that same critical thinking to the idea of red states and blue states. Even if we know that the narrative is oversimplified, it is so deeply ingrained in our culture. We need to get better at countering it, even in our own organizing. I want you to come away with the acknowledgement that the red state, blue state narratives are misleading but incredibly pervasive. Here's an example. Oregon is a blue state according to most of the nation, but it's really about western versus eastern Oregon, divided by the Cascades. Except if we're being precise, we might say that it's the Willamette Valley that's blue. But there are conservative areas within the valley, and liberal tech or art cities like Bend and Ashland outside of Portland and the main college towns are left out of this map. The problem with this spatialized us versus them thinking is that it promotes two mentalities that sabotage our organizing. Cities versus the rest of the world, like we're under siege, or cities versus a vacuum. Urban centers are the only places worth organizing because they have all the people. We know that conservatism and fascism exist even in liberal cities like Portland. We should extend that same fine-tuned thinking to challenge stereotypes outside of Portland. There are people there we should be organizing with, and people there worth fighting for. I mentioned that rural Oregon and rural America share material needs with their urban counterparts. People need to eat, sleep, and take care of their families. CEOs and investors who control industries are trying their hardest to extract as much profit as possible from the people and the land. That being said, we can start to understand rural areas by looking into how they've been shaped historically and economically to look different from urban and suburban areas. There are always terms of land ownership and current disputes over land and water, natural resource industries and the people that provide that labor, that includes agriculture, mining, and timber, issues of employment and unemployment, It's not very commonly known, but service and hospitality industries and prisons are both big employers in rural areas. There are always infrastructure issues to be addressed. In many cases, it's water and sewage, but it might also be power and transportation. Healthcare issues exist across the board, and that includes closures of clinics and the distance to specialized care for pregnancy, small children, and people experiencing addiction. There are issues of weakening social fabric, such as the closures of libraries, churches, and newspapers, and always, or at least almost always, issues of geography and distance. Each of these is a rabbit hole. You can start reading news articles and analysis, and you'll see how these are ways to understand problems that are common to a lot of rural areas, but also ways that you can get to better understand a particular town, region, or industry. Laws and policies about those rural issues are often decided in city centers, either by larger populations or by the companies and politicians that exploit the rural landscape as a resource for materials and labor. Something that resonates with people in rural areas is the idea of nothing about us without us, and we can put that into action in our organizing. In terms of representation, when we're talking about something like the Green New Deal, we should do our utmost to research and engage people living in the areas that would be affected by something like switches from diesel to electric vehicles, whether those are personal use or for agricultural use. In terms of decision-making, rural areas are familiar with change. They aren't as stagnant and backward as the world would have everyone believe. But imposed change doesn't go over well. No one likes paternalism or condescension, so what do? We commit to no more top-down or center-out decision-making. Communication. Programs like Medicare for All work best when we can communicate how they will affect rural areas. Part of that communication depends on good principles like listening, reciprocity, adjustment, and perseverance. It's not going to happen with one tweet or one article or one workshop. These are conversations worth having and a relationship worth building, but it's going to take some time. I want to talk about obstacles. Some of these are going to be regular challenges for rural organizers within their own communities, but also anyone looking to come in and help from an urban group. Trust. Unless you have a connection to that person or group, you are likely going to be confronting mistrust that has built up over several decades. In some cases, it's a matter of social responses to political and economic policies. For example, a question about climate change might bring up mill closures and loss of timber revenue. Yes, climate change is an urgent issue. Those are also very deep wounds, and you can't force your way through that. Access. Door knocking is hard when you're on rural roads and people aren't used to strangers coming by. Meeting spaces are fewer and farther between, especially for large numbers. Getting people together from multiple towns to meet in one place can involve multiple hours of driving, just as in a city it might take multiple hours on public transportation or by bike. Resources. If you're familiar with the idea of smaller tax bases making it hard to fund schools and libraries, you'll probably have a decent idea of why it can be hard to summon resources within a rural organizing situation. And I want to talk about safety. We should be ready to acknowledge that rural America is more diverse than it's usually portrayed. We can also recognize that racism, homophobia, and transphobia exist in urban spaces as well. However, it's true that there are many places in rural America where challenges to whiteness and bigotry get dismissed. Conversations can get unpredictable and uncomfortable when we pursue them. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue them, however. No one should feel pressured to go into these spaces that present threats to their physical or emotional well-being. That does put it on some of us to exercise our privilege and get the harder conversations started where we can. What are some strategies that we can use? On a personal level, build trust through communication. Good organizing principles hold true. Lead with issues, not jargon. Dealing with the reactionary conservative culture that's dominant in some places requires some different skill sets. Arguing doesn't always help. Confrontation can be counterproductive if it's not strategic. Get used to the discomfort of challenging assumptions, both yours and theirs. For example, plenty of people believe that Democrat is exactly the same as socialist and communist. Many of them do not understand what socialism and communism can offer because of Red Scare propaganda. They assume that Democrat is as far left as the spectrum goes. On the other hand, assuming that your socialism is the answer to every problem, even the ones you don't understand yet, is not going to get you anywhere fast. On an organizational level, most importantly, reach out to groups that are doing this work already. There are people who have been doing this work for decades. They know the physical, social, and political landscapes. You need to trust their knowledge and be of service to them. Why should we care? In 2 words, solidarity forever. LGBTQ people live and work in rural America. Black and brown people, immigrants, and Native Americans live in rural America. There are leftists organizing in rural America. Besides the many DSA chapters and organizing committees that have sprung up in recent years, there are socialists and communists that have been working there for generations. And rural America, from mines to farmland, has a rich history of labor movements and community organizing. We can't give up on our comrades, and we can't abandon the people who are also fighting capitalism and fascism in this country. Some good sources to visit and follow include the following. For news sources, look up the Daily Yonder, High Country News, Rural Assembly, and Rural Organizing Project, the last of which is local to Oregon, but has good insights into organizing challenges around the country. For podcasts, I recommend the Trillbilly Workers' Party, which includes Terrence Ray, Tom Sexton, and Tanya Turner, Homecomers from Sarah Smarsh, and the Working People's Podcast from Max Alvarez. For Twitter users, you can look up Prairie Eric, Bryce Oates, and J.N. Ruprecht. They are good places to start, and there are also many others to discover. If you can remember only 3 things going away from this, please keep these in mind. Rural is more than a myth and a monolith. There is no one rural place or people. You always have more to learn, but a good place to start is unlearning what popular culture and mainstream politics have taught you. Building trust is a long-term project. It's going to take a while, and it needs to last a while. This is work that has to stick. Finally, and most simply, a socialist future must include rural voices.